Cartoon Network has always been one to, let's say, experiment. Their darkest and one of their more unique shows was Courage the Cowardly Dog. It's about a dog trying to protect his farmer owners from the terrors of the monsters of the week. It stands to reason that the show itself can be unnerving at times, or even flat out scary to kids and even adults. Needless to say, there's more than enough material here to explore some of the darkest moments. Hey guys, I'm Brad with Wicked Binge, and today we're counting down the top 10 most disturbing Courage the Cowardly Dog episodes. Let's get started.
I think we got them.
It's saying something when Freaky Fred ranks at number 10 on our list. This episode is all about Muriel's nephew, Fred. He drops by his aunt's house for a visit, and through a faulty lock and Eustace being cruel to Courage, Courage and Fred are both locked in the bathroom. While being locked up, Fred decides to give Courage a shave, as in actually trimming the poor dog down to just his tail, alongside with a thank you message from Fred. Courage, not that happy with getting a haircut this close, is not cooperative at all. He goes as far as to hide in the toilet and even the sink. Both places are so odd that even Fred drops his eternal smile in sheer surprise at what Courage is doing. Eventually, Courage manages to call the home for Freaky Barbers and rightfully gets Fred locked up again. It's pretty clear as to why this episode is disturbing. It's because of Fred. The guy is an escaped mental patient, or rather a mental barber, and speaks in rhymes throughout the episode. He's distant from the world around him and thinks that everything is going great and that everyone loves him, even as Courage is cowering in fear and is being dragged off. However, there's one big reason he isn't any higher. Despite how unnerving he is, he really doesn't do anything really disturbing. Sure, shaving all the hair off of an animal is creepy, but compared to the other crimes and heinous acts on this list, that's a small price to pay, even if it is naughty. For one entry that isn't immediately obvious, we have Human Habit Trail coming in at number 9. Doc Gerbil is introduced as a vacuum cleaner seller, only to shrink Muriel and Eustace and kidnap them. His reason for doing so is that he knows about how humans experiment on animals and wants Courage to be a free animal as well. Of course, Courage, being who he is, decides to instead follow suit, and we discover that Doc Gerbil is more than okay with experimenting on humans as revenge for the science animals. Of course, the Bags aren't like those scientists, and he doesn't seem to understand why Courage would save them, believing he's doing a good thing. Like with Fred, Gerbil does believe he's being a good person. However, unlike Fred, the stuff Gerbil does is undoubtedly much more disturbing, like experimenting on poor unsuspecting humans who haven't done anything wrong, like with Lint Lady, turning her hands and feet into suction cups. This eventually escalates into a boat chase with no music or sounds, at least until the waterfall and Courage screaming. It's a very surreal finale to say the least. Despite claiming to be a good person, he definitely isn't, at least by our standards. He's certainly an egotist, if that unsettling ride based off of It's a Small World is any indication. It's Doc Gerbil's world here at number 9. In 8th place, we have Curtain of Cruelty. This is one of those episodes where it has both humor and darkness mashed into it. During a trip downtown, a giant curtain falls over the town, and it causes the townsfolk to become crude and mean. They even hate the idea of people being nice so much that they throw Muriel out just for saying thanks and arrest her for apologizing for hitting a girl with her truck door. Meanwhile, Muriel seems to be resistant to the curtain's effects, along with Courage, and as Muriel is forced through a video telling her to kill a hamster, Courage is looking for the culprit of this curtain, only to find Floyd. Using Muriel's homemade fabric softener, the same fabric that kept him nice, Courage was able to turn the machine that Floyd was using into a machine that makes people nice. At first, it kinda seems like the Tower of Zalost. But however, while that one focuses more on the creator of what was making others unhappy, this focused more on the townsfolk affected by him. While the people end up becoming overly cruel and dark, they end up passing that fine line from so mean it's hard to watch to so mean it's kinda hilarious. Heck, it's so nasty now that Eustace is elected the mayor of the city. And while they try to force Muriel to prove her worth by killing a hamster, it's kind of cartoonish cruelty that helps keep this show both funny and disturbing. It's a disturbing episode due to how everyone acts, sure, but we can't help but chuckle a bit as well. It's a good blend of humor and horror, just the reason why this show managed to be so loved for so long. For the normally lucky 7th place, we have the original series finale, The Great Fusilli. Alright, so everyone knows of the terrifying ending. Fusilli, a talking alligator, travels to the little farmhouse in nowhere to offer Courage, Eustace, and Muriel the chance at stardom. The act is then performing on a stage as an invisible crowd cheers them on. This is already creepy enough, but it gets worse as magic strings turn them into actual puppets. Courage is able to get his now puppet-formed owners back, but isn't able to turn them back to normal. Meanwhile, Fusilli ends up succumbing to his own magic, being transformed into a puppet himself. As unnerving as this episode is, the scariest thing about it is that it was originally meant to be the series finale. This meant that the last scene of the show was just Courage descending further and further into insanity as he reenacts his daily life with his now puppet owners. Of course, what ultimately puts this episode lower is that it wasn't the end, and the series continued, letting this episode just vanish into thin air. However, the fact this could have been the end is something that shouldn't be understated, and thus gets a slot here. Obviously, if this was the actual finale, it would be much higher. But as it is, it's still creepy, even if the show still goes on. At number 6, we have The Demon and the Mattress. Due to Muriel not sleeping well, she orders a new bed. However, this bed is cursed, with the scary face on it, the delivery men being weasels and scaring Courage, and possessing Muriel. What follows is Courage having to find a way to get the demon out of Muriel, who's currently trapped inside the demon, screaming for Courage to help her. Even Eustace recognizes the severity of the situation and helps out in his own way, only to get possessed by the mattress himself. After knocking him out, Muriel calls the mattress to be returned the next day. This is a plot of something that crawled out of The Exorcist, with green smoke rising from the bed, Muriel levitating, and even puking and turning her head around 360 degrees and falling off. These references were so disturbing that some of them don't even appear in other countries. However, this is balanced out by the mattress demon being voiced by Jim Cummings, the same voice actor as Winnie the Pooh. So expect a bit of brevity, like with the mattress demon playing a round of thumb war with Courage. Overall, this may be an earlier episode, but definitely a dark episode regardless. One perfect to watch with a cup of tea. Alright, past the halfway mark, and up next is Remembrance of Courage's Past. Over the years, many have wondered what keeps Courage going, and just where his actual parents are. Well, this episode offers a depressing, yet horrifying answer. After getting traumatized by a carton of milk with missing dogs on it, Courage is taken to a vet to be checked out. However, this same vet was the reason Courage is so scared, and perhaps why he's so nervous and startled by everything. Back when he was a pup, this nightmarish vet launched his own parents into space in an attempt to create a super space animal. How we got to that conclusion from just 2 posters is beyond us, but what isn't beyond us is realizing just how tragic and nerve-wracking this whole experience is, with Courage about to lose his owners thanks to the vets. Thankfully, the doctor ends up in his own rocket, only to realize that the experiment didn't work, as the dogs are on the same planet his stranded asteroid is on, Courage's parents included. They all want to beat him up now, and rightfully so. Normally, Courage's conflicts aren't this personal. Usually, it's just a random monster stumbling upon their house, scaring Courage and his folks before eventually leaving. But this is much more serious and personal with Courage. Upon seeing that milk carton, instead of his usual screams of comedic degrees, he's just silent. Nothing. Not even Eustace with his usual mass charade, scaring the dog would get him to move an inch. Of course, considering just how vile and cruel this doctor is, and just how he was the reason Courage is an orphan, we really can't blame the poor dog. This is just a hard episode to watch. An episode about how one man manages to break families apart, all in the name of science. Outside the top 3 is The House of Discontent. This is where we get our first look with the spirit of the Harvest Moon, and he certainly isn't a pretty sight to look at. Due to just how pathetic their farmland is, the spirit of the Harvest Moon decides to give the Bags and their dog an ultimatum: grow something, anything, or leave the farm. Despite Courage's best efforts, they fail to meet their goal at first and get locked in the basement. To make matters worse, it's also getting hotter thanks to the Harvest Moon spirit. However, thanks to Eustace sweating during this time, Courage was able to get a plant to grow and appease the spirit, earning the freedom for him and his owners. The thing that really puts this episode so high is how unsettling the spirit is. He's a floating white head with black eyes that are angry with how poor the farmland is. He shows this anger by attacking Muriel with living food, while takes his anger out on Eustace by blasting his tub's pipes open, and when they fail, tries to melt them both. His low-tone yet obviously angry voice certainly doesn't help matters. However, what ultimately puts this episode underneath the top 3 is that he's willing to leave and return the farm to normal after seeing a plant grow. Just goes to show you that if you don't take care of the land will take care of you in the worst way possible. At our third most terrifying episode, you all know this was coming, King Ramses' Curse. Return the slab or suffer my curse. Those 7 words managed to get under everyone's skin, for a very good reason. After finding an old slab that some thieves stole from King Ramses' tomb, Eustace's greed puts the family in jeopardy as King Ramses comes to the farmhouse to reclaim it. A flood is first sent upon their house, almost drowning them, had it not been for Courage's brave act of swimming down to the basement to drain the water. A more lighthearted plague is soon followed up with a repeating song filling the air until Courage smashes the record. Finally, the scariest plague. A swarm of locusts fills the air and devours the house as well as Eustace, trapping him in the slab. Did we mention that this locust can devour anything it comes across? It was capable of even destroying the original thieves and their car. This episode is infamous for one big reason. The man in gauze, King Ramses. Like with the spirit of the Harvest Moon, he has a completely different art style, being a CGI animated figure. His movement is rather slow and sluggish, waving in the wind. He doesn't move an inch from his spot, instead, just acting like he's rooted there. His low rumbling voice only just added the mystique and fear he brings forth. While we do think there are those scarier than him, we don't blame anyone for getting creeped out by this monster of the week. For our second place spookiest episode, we have The Mask. In comparison to our other episodes, this one is so scary due to just how realistic it is. After being assaulted by a mysterious masked woman called Kitty, Courage ends up thinking that the mask itself is evil and tries to turn it in to the police. However, the truth is much darker than that. In reality, Kitty is more or less locked out of her apartment as her best friend, Bunny, is stuck there with her abusive boyfriend, Mad Dog. In comparison to other nightmarish scenarios like curses and demented barbers, this one is significantly more realistic and down to earth, just with animals in place of humans. Mad Dog is an abusive boyfriend who's more than okay with putting Bunny down to elevate himself. With him being killed by being run over by a train, his death comes off as a relief, as well as a bit unnerving to say the least. There are also heavy themes of misogyny and sexism, with Kitty abusing Courage due to her thinking that all dogs are bad, a stance we can't blame her for given how terrible Mad Dog is. Even Courage seems to be paranoid of Kitty, and like her, with her beating him down and the only other cat we see being the villainous cats, it's hard to blame him as well. Of course, there's also the potential of Kitty and Bunny actually being gay, as shown in their reunion in the end of the episode. This is definitely the most realistic episode of Courage, and with all the heavy themes, it definitely showed real courage and deserves our silver trophy. For our most disturbing and scary episode, it will have to go to a choice that isn't quite obvious at first, but we think deserves the top spot: the Windmill Vandals. You know that old windmill, the one turning ever so slowly in the background? Well, it's actually rather important to the Bags. Not only is it their source of power, but the windmill was also a magical charm made to ward off evil spirits, known as the Windmill Vandals. You see, 250 years ago, the original owner of the house was the only person who used a stick with a windmill, despite the rising love and fondness for water wheels owned by the Vandals. However, the water eventually dried out, and in anger, they went after the owner of the windmill, who was able to ward them off thanks to carving magic markings into the windmill, one for each fan. Now that the windmill stopped, they came back from the dead, with their undead skeletal forms riding horses and weaponry. even decapitating everyone's heads. This threat is so sincere, it's one of the few times where Muriel and Eustace are on the same page as Courage and have to work together to save the day. They are ruthless and show no signs of slowing down or stopping, and they're only stopped thanks to the windmill being repaired. This puts them as one of the few threats that Courage doesn't necessarily stop, at least permanently. Sure, continuity is a fickle thing here, but at any other time when the windmill was destroyed and stopped throughout the series, they would have been able to return and continue to hound the Bags down. They could return anytime, anywhere. They are beyond death at this point, and only magic symbols scribbled onto a windmill can put them to rest, as long as it keeps spinning. For this fact of their ever-looming threat, this episode is at the top spot of this list of the most horrifying Courage episodes. And with that, the nightmare is over. Did we miss an episode you thought should have made the cut? Or do you think we were just being a bunch of stupid dogs? Feel free to scream your opinions at us in the comments below. If you're feeling brave still, feel free to check out our other videos and hit that notification bell. But most importantly, stay wicked.